Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, October 15, 2025, and our dear friend, Max Blumenthal, is back here with us. Welcome back, Max.
Great to see you, Nima.
Please subscribe and hit like button and follow Max and what he's doing with his website and his YouTube channel. They're doing a lot, and you can learn a lot following them. And right below his name, you see the Gray Zone News, and it's on a website and a YouTube channel. Max, let's start with the Trump's so-called peace summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. What was the end game when you look at the summit participation, the discussions there, and the outcome?
Well, to answer your question directly, the summit was the end game. Standing in front of a banner that reads Peace 2025 with Donald Trump flanked by the so-called Arab world and the so-called or members of the so-called international community who Trump humiliated one after another. That was the point. And Trump appears as though he has solved the most intractable problem in recent human history. And it gives the image of a resolution to the Israel-Palestine crisis, even though Netanyahu was not present. Netanyahu is now claiming, I couldn't be there because of Simchat Torah and the ultra-Orthodox members of my coalition. There was a Jewish holiday coming up, and so I couldn't be there. That's not why he was there. He was there because he didn't want to be forced into potentially Trump forcing him to shake hands with Mahmoud Abbas, which would tear into his coalition and would contain echoes of the famous, or I would say notorious, handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, which Rabin was assassinated for, and which Netanyahu incited and helped incite the assassination. Netanyahu's whole coalition rests on his promise to obstruct a two-state solution, to prevent a Palestinian state, and actually to prevent peace. And Donald Trump could care less about addressing the real roots and actual causes of the conflict. He just wants to get a kind of diplomatic win. Steve Witkoff, who is his main negotiator on the issue of Israel-Hamas negotiations, as well as many other conflicts, essentially retired after the Sharm el-Sheikh summit. And so Trump has just put this all behind him. He is concerned primarily with his legacy. He did not get the Nobel Peace Prize and was obsessed with getting the Nobel Peace Prize to consolidate his legacy forever. So this was the next best thing. And as far as enforcing the ceasefire, well, we have to look at what Trump said in the Knesset. There are two parts to this. There was the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, which was just a PR exercise for Donald Trump, in which the so-called Arab states were convinced that they could actually exercise leverage along with Turkey over Trump, which has proven ridiculous again, or delusional again and again. And then there was the Knesset speech where Donald Trump basically consolidated his legacy as the protector of Greater Israel and paid tribute to his top patron, the Israeli warlord, Miriam Adelson, who is the heir to the fortune of casino baron Sheldon Adelson. And it was there that Donald Trump said, she's sitting there looking so innocent, but she's not innocent. She has $60 billion in the bank. And she was the most frequent visitor to the White House, along with her husband, Sheldon, who was very aggressive. I mean, it was kind of like a roast, but at the same time, he's paying tribute to her. And he's saying they basically controlled my entire policy outlook on the region. In fact, it was through Miriam Adelson's money that Donald Trump was bribed to relocate the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was an extremely provocative move that I think actually was a factor in October 7th, because it puts more pressure on the Palestinians of East Jerusalem. It invalidates a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem, and it puts more pressure on the Al-Aqsa compound, which is being constantly invaded by fanatical Israeli messianic religious nationalists, including Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. So Donald Trump does all that. He admits that it was because he was bribed. And then he says that Miriam Adelson was asked, he asked her, which country do you love more, America or Israel? And she didn't answer, and he knows it was Israel. So he acknowledges that he was basically bribed by an Israel first billionaire to wage political warfare on Palestinians and on the region on behalf of her country. Is this someone who is actually going to apply leverage to Israel to enforce a ceasefire that Israel is already, in just about 72 hours, violated in flagrantly provocative ways? I don't think so. So where is the counter pressure from Turkey, for example, from the Arabs who showed up at Sharm el-Sheikh? The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia didn't go, or they didn't send leading figures. They just sent like lower level officials. I'm not seeing it. So again, I think this was an exercise in propaganda for Trump to complement a ceasefire, which is not peace. It is merely a pause.
Max, one of the things that has happened during the talks, during the negotiations between the United States and Arab states, we see 4 Qatari negotiators were somehow they passed away. I don't know what was the reason of that, and what do we know about that?
Well, I'll tell you the reason. We've been able to get an investigative team on the ground in Egypt, and they've been able to comb the country and question officials, and we know the answer. Actually, they just fell off a balcony, so I can't tell you. That's what I was told. Our team just fell off a balcony. I'm joking, obviously. It's impossible to know what's happening in Egypt. I mean, it's one of the most difficult places in the region for a journalist to operate. So I would have no way of knowing. This team of, I don't know if they were diplomats or security officials. I heard they were security officials. The official story is that their steering column broke in a Mercedes. It was like a Mercedes Sprinter, I think. This is a pretty well-built vehicle. So I'm not accepting the official story. And I mean, just think of all the times we've heard of activists and dissidents who fall off balconies in Egypt. It just happens again and again. It's like it's like gallows humor among Egyptians. Oh, he fell off the balcony. So no one can accept the official story. We have the background of Israel attempting to assassinate the Qatari negotiating team, which actually is one of the things that triggered Trump to make the one phone call, the only phone call that was needed to actually get to a ceasefire, something Biden refused to do, really demonstrating how much leverage the U.S. does have if it's willing to sideline the Israel first billionaires that control Congress and national campaigns. And Trump was willing to do that. So is this revenge somehow for the fact that the Hamas negotiating team was targeted in Qatar? Qatar forced Trump to elicit an apology from Netanyahu for that strike. Is this revenge for that saga by Israel? Is Israel trying to send a message to Qatar that we can still harm you in a third country? Or was another intrigue at play? I have no idea. I can only offer theories, but the official story in Egypt can never be trusted when there's an unusual death like this.
Donald Trump, when it comes to Brazil, for example, he wants to be tough. He tries to interfere in the internal policy of Brazil. Siding with the former president of Brazil. But when you look at his performance in the Knesset, he was somehow humiliating his position, the position of the United States. He talked about his daughter moving from Christianity to Jewish, because of Israel.
Yep.
It's not because of she wants to be closer to her husband. It's all because of Israel. The way that he was playing the game, he asked the president of Israel to pardon Netanyahu. What was that? What can we what is, because we have to understand the reality of what's going on in the mind of the president of the United States, who really desperately wants the world to see him as a tough guy. But that wasn't Donald Trump in Israel.
Well, there are two issues there. One is Trump's personal sensibility, which makes him popular inside the United States. It's the sensibility of a casino owner and someone who grew up on his father's construction sites, hanging out with construction workers, who really likes to entertain his audience. And he would get up at casinos and introduce notable people. And he owned like a second-rate football league called the USFL, and he hung around pro athletes. And he just loves to get up there and make everybody laugh. It's sort of like an old school, almost like when the mafia owned Vegas, and they would just come out and, Bugsy and the guys would come out on stage with Dean Martin and the Rat Pack, and they would joke around in front of the audience. And at the same time, they would apply some very dirty tactics behind the scenes. He comes out of that world, and he's roasting his own daughter, and he has some contempt for her because she's sort of a liberal who likes to hang out in Aspen and Davos along with Jared. Jared suddenly materializes and makes her Jewish. She was actually converted through Chabad. They go to this elite Upper East Side synagogue that's sort of like where a lot of very powerful people go. So she got involved in a different power network than Trump and Trump Incorporated. And she's sort of involved in a kind of cult. And I think Trump realizes it, and he loves to humiliate people in public and entertain audiences. On the issue of Netanyahu's pardon, part of that comes from Trump's sensibility, because he's constantly and justifiably accused of corruption. And the corruption that we see in the United States makes the cases that Netanyahu's facing pale in comparison. I mean, one of Trump's underlings, Tom Homan, who's in charge of mass deportations, he just took a bag of cash from FBI agents, $50,000 in exchange for a bribe, like a naked bribe. This, should wind him up in prison. And Trump said he did nothing wrong. So Netanyahu is accused of taking champagne and cigars, about $130,000 worth, from his friends, including Miriam Adelson was someone who testified against him. And Trump's joking about it and saying, how is this corruption? I mean, the whole Trump family is dedicated to corruption. It's using power in order to profit, whether it's by trying to take over Greenland or launching a line of golden cell phones, Trump cell phones, that they try to sell to suggestible members of their base. And they use presidential influence to make money. They're doing meme coin rug pulls. They've got, while they're shifting crypto policy in favor of Donald Trump, it's next level corruption. So he's making light of that in a way, but he's also roasting Netanyahu. But finally, there is a clever piece to what Donald Trump is doing, because if Netanyahu is not pardoned, and it kind of took me too long to get to this point, so I apologize. But if Netanyahu is not pardoned, he is more likely to launch a war on Iran, because his coalition is more likely to fragment around the ceasefire, coming under pressure from the more extreme members. It's difficult for him to re-enter Gaza at this point. It will piss off Trump, So the best way for Netanyahu to unite his coalition and the Israeli public is by launching another war with Iran and once again dragging the US in, unless he feels comfortable about leaving power and saying, hey, I was the longest serving Israeli prime minister in history. I managed to get our country through a very difficult existential war, and I'm not going to be prosecuted. If he's not pardoned, he's got to stay in power until his death. So I think that's the reason Trump said that. And it was in a way wise for Trump to do that because Donald Trump is not going to do what's necessary, what Biden should have done, which is to bring Netanyahu down by applying enormous leverage and pressure that forces him into a situation where there's a ceasefire without total victory, which would have blown up his coalition and sent him back to court. But Biden was too much of a coward and too much of a subject of Israeli influence to do that, as even Kamala Harris is now saying in her own memoir.
The rhetoric of disarmament of Hamas and, demilitarizing Gaza, how is that going to help the United States, Donald Trump's position? Because after all, I see Donald Trump putting himself and his administration in a corner that it could be so hard to get out of that corner. With the same case, we had the same thing with the case of Ukraine. But when it comes to the Middle East, what is the point?
What is the point of...
What is the point putting himself in a position? He says that if Hamas doesn't disarm, we're going to do it. We're going to go there and we're going to disarm Hamas and demilitarizing Gaza. This is not going to my understanding, this is not going to happen, which means more war, bringing more war to Gaza instead of, avoiding new clashes between Israelis and Hamas.
Well, this is the problem with Trump is he'll cede to reality and then he'll shift days later back into an entirely different rhetorical position that almost makes it seem like he has a body double, like a neoconservative body double. I mean, he's threatening Russia now with Tomahawk missiles, which is extremely provocative. It may be kind of like a Tomahawks, because it took so long after Leopard tanks were promised to Ukraine or ATACMS missiles were promised before they actually showed up on the field, or F-16s. But Tomahawk missiles is another level of provocation because Russia has no way of determining if these are nuclear tipped missiles or not. It's a further escalation toward nuclear confrontation. And Russia is openly recognizing that. Trump is completely caved to the neocons on this issue when, he was just in Alaska with Putin. What was the point of that? That was just to make Trump seem like a man of peace as he was vying for the Nobel Prize. Trump gets the Nobel Prize. The Trump family and Trump Incorporated will do that much more business and will seem that much more credible. So that's what Trump is doing here as well. There's not any actual basis to Trump's desire for peace to address the real root issues of the conflict, like colonization, occupation, denial of rights to Palestinians. However, on Air Force One, I'm sure you saw this clip, Donald Trump ceded to reality on the issue of Hamas maintaining weapons and said that we gave Hamas permission to be able to maintain order in the Gaza Strip and to clean up the Gaza Strip when he was asked about the execution of collaborators. And these are collaborators that were gangs of bandits that were supported by Israel, protected with Israeli air cover, protected in Israeli de facto military bases in Gaza, the Yasser Abu Shabab gang, members of the Dagmash family. And Donald Trump said, well, Hamas has to maintain order. And therefore, he acknowledged that one of the terms that his team agreed to was ambiguity around Hamas having weapons. So disarming Hamas, for now, is off the table. Maybe next week, Donald Trump will say they need to be totally destroyed. But this is such a major blow to Netanyahu politically because he had promised his base total victory. That was his mantra for the last 2 years. I mean, these blue hats that looked like the Trump hats that said "Make America Great Again" were distributed to Likud activists to wear at rallies. And, by declaring total victory, what Netanyahu, or outlining an objective of total victory, what Netanyahu would do was he would kick the can down the road on the so-called hostages, and it would allow him to constantly move the goalpost on negotiations with Hamas, which doomed many of the so-called hostages to death, often through Israeli airstrikes. And so a large sector of Israeli society is furious at Netanyahu for outlining such a delusional objective. And now Trump has exposed the whole thing and said there isn't going to be total victory. Israeli media is filled with anguished reports about Hamas reconstituting itself, about the Al-Qassam brigades showing themselves in the streets and demonstrating that they still have complete control. And the aid is getting through. The aid is beginning to get through to people because the looters that Israel was backing are being vanquished. So Israel has reduced the amount of aid by 50%, violating another term of the ceasefire, which Trump refuses to enforce. But back to your question, I mean, on the issue of Hamas disarmament, I think that's off the table for now.
Smotrich says that we will establish settlements in Gaza. If let's assume that they go in that direction to disarm Hamas, and Hamas agrees to be, to do some sort of modification, changes internally, just to somehow facilitate the agreement between the West and Hamas and Gazans. When they see, I'm talking about Gazans, when they see Smotrich talking about the new settlements in Gaza, what that would bring to them, that would bring the case of the West Bank. There is, how could that, who has the upper hand in the Netanyahu's administration? In the Netanyahu administration, who has the, is that about Smotrich and together with Ben-Gvir, or because I somehow feel that the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they're different from Netanyahu and his faction in the government. What's your take on that?
They are different. I mean, they're religious nationalists, messianists. Netanyahu is completely secular, probably doesn't believe in God. He is actually sort of the radical center of this coalition. Netanyahu is holding the coalition together as a uniting figure. And what comes after Netanyahu is unclear. But Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have played the role of the spoilers in every ceasefire negotiation until Trump came down and actually just absolutely demanded one. And his team demonstrated some flexibility with both sides, particularly Hamas, allowing it sort of a yes, but. And then there was a vote among all the ministers, and Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and an irrelevant but extremely radical, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but another radical settler figure named Orit Strzok voted against it, but they were widely outnumbered. And so they were actually sidelined. Smotrich is speaking on behalf of the religious nationalist camp in Israel, including many that don't vote for his party or for him, but he's trying to emerge as sort of a spokesman for the Messianist camp that fought in unprecedented numbers in Gaza. And if you saw the imagery of soldiers erecting gigantic menorahs in Hanukkah in the ruins of Shujaiya, or dancing with Torah scrolls and destroyed homes, I mean, this is who Smotrich is speaking to. And many of them also died or suffered injuries. And they resent the fact that they're not getting what they want after making this great sacrifice, because what they wanted was a new Gush Katif, referring to the settlement of about 9,000 fanatics that was forcibly evacuated from Gaza in 2005 following the end of the Second Intifada. They were actually pushed out by Hamas and the Al-Qassam brigades and Palestinian resistance, and then Gaza was placed under siege. And this was done by another figure who was the godfather of the Likud party, Ariel Sharon. Wasn't expected that Ariel Sharon would do something like this. He was in many ways a supporter of the settlement enterprise, although he himself was secular, was not a religious nationalist. So there is a difference between these two camps. And is it feasible for the settlers to go into Gaza at this point? No, because Hamas still has its weapons. It looked like Israel was moving towards trying to ethnically cleanse the north by destroying all the major residential towers in Gaza City, by destroying as much of Gaza City as possible. Jabalia camp is mostly destroyed. Beit Hanun is mostly destroyed. They were trying to push everyone south. And I think Smotrich believed that if this could continue, then, they could just go in, clear some rubble, and bring the settlers in there. But the other issue is that throughout the years, the attempt to settle Gaza was generally a failure, because anyone outside of the most fanatical spheres of the religious nationalist camp who tried to settle in Gaza didn't really want to be there and left. And so they were left with just 9,000 nutcases. The more secular settlers, those who want cheaper housing and have anti-Palestinian attitudes, they'll go to the major settlement blocks and get a very nice condo for much less than anything inside the Green Line in Ariel or Male Adumim and these kinds of places. So why would you want to go to Gaza? So I think that's right now a more distant fantasy, but it's something that they would push for if a figure like Netanyahu leaves the scene and maybe someone with more religious nationalist credentials comes in.
Yeah. Iranians have decided not to participate in Egypt. The argument on their part was the foreign minister of Iran said that the United States has attacked us and they're threatening us a lot of sanctions on Iran. That's the reason we are not going to be there, but we are welcoming any sort of solution for Gaza. Do you see anything beyond that? Beyond what the foreign minister of Iran said as one of the main reasons that Iran didn't participate?
I think there's a security reason, given the role of the U.S. in assassinating Iran's top leaders, given the role of Israel in assassinating Iranians, putting yourself in a country like Egypt that may not be able to provide security, given that Israel attacked the Hamas negotiating team inside Qatar, it would have been absurd to enter a scenario like that. And also given Egypt's coordination with Israeli intelligence and Israeli security, given the amount of Mossad penetration in Egyptian society, I think it would have been a huge risk. Diplomatically, it would have, what would the point of it had been, given that the entire spectacle was geared to show the dominance of the US, and that the only reason that any country would be there would be to demonstrate their desire to still be within Washington's orbit and part of a transatlantic alliance. All the Arab states that were there depend on US aid, with especially Egypt. So Iran continued to demonstrate its independence from these hollow spectacles and from the unipolar vision that Washington seeks to project on the world by basically staying home. And that, I think, was the rational move. And I think that'll become clearer in the coming weeks as Trump refuses to exert leverage to actually make peace. And war begins to creep to Iran's doorstep, courtesy of Israel and Netanyahu.
The main issue with Gaza is their right to decide about their future. but that wasn't mentioned. That was not mentioned in the peace plan, in the so-called peace plan. There, the point number 19, it mentions that the United States considers the desire of Palestinians to have a state, nothing more than that. What is that the issue? Why have they decided to agree with the United States if there is no mention of the Palestinian state in that document?
I mean, Trump didn't even mention Palestinians in his Knesset speech. He didn't say, they've suffered enormously and you need to consider them as a people, like just as humans. He didn't say anything like that in the Knesset. They didn't exist. And then Mahmoud Abbas, what was the purpose of him being in Sharm el-Sheikh? I mean, his presence was completely diminished. And behind the scenes, he and the Palestinian Authority have been lobbying against the release of Marwan Barghouti, who would be the most unifying figure who Hamas has sought to release, even though he is not someone who has been friendly to or a member of Hamas, because he's a unifying figure with street credibility that transcends the factionalism of Palestinian politics, who could emerge as a figure to lead a unity government towards a kind of Palestinian state. So Abbas is participating with Israel and Trump in undermining this process just to maintain his gilded prison in Ramallah, the 5-star occupation. As far as the Palestinians, I mean, the issues of occupation and colonization were never addressed by Trump or by anyone in this entire charade. All that took place was a relief, a welcome relief to the killing and the release of 2,000 Palestinians, including 1,700 who were kidnapped by Israel inside the Gaza Strip since October 7th. And this may have been the best deal that could have been taken under the circumstances, given the preponderance of power that Israel has over the Western powers. But it doesn't address anything and doesn't move any closer towards a Palestinian state. So, I mean, we're set for more conflict.
Max, you wrote a piece. I'm not talking about you, your team, and your team wrote a piece on the Gray Zone News about the secret Israeli base being hit by Iranian strike during the 12-day war. And what do we know about what has happened in those days, considering this case?
Well, this was a report by Jack Paulson, who is an independent reporter who has emerged from the tech industry to expose the role of tech in collaborating with the military, the intelligence services, and with Israel, particularly Israel's Unit 8200, and has produced some of the most indispensable work on that subject over the past several years since he quit his job at Google, and Wyatt Reed, who's my colleague at the Gray Zone. And what they did was they managed to geolocate Site 81, which is a hyper-secretive de facto Israeli military base that provides command and control to the military intelligence apparatus of Israel. And it is nestled within the Hakiria complex, which is a large tower in North Tel Aviv, off Menachem Begin Boulevard, right near the Azrieli shopping mall and Azrieli complex. And it surrounded itself by a series of residential towers, as well as the Israeli Air Force headquarters. And I've written about this before, how this represents the ultimate human shielding of the central node of Israel's genocide machine and its Fortress of Zion bunker, where Netanyahu and his inner circle hide whenever there's retaliation for the wars that they launch across the region, most recently in June during the 12-day war. So on June 13th, in the midst of the 12-day war, targets near Hakiria were hit. One of them was the North Tower of the Da Vinci apartment complex, which is a residential tower built next to Hakiria, and it's just south of the Kanarit Israeli Air Force towers. And what Jack Paulson and Wyatt Reed determined was it was also above this underground military intelligence bunker, which is jointly administered by the US and Israeli militaries. And they used through a collection of leaked emails from the Handala leaks, which contain the emails of top-level Israeli military and diplomatic officials, as well as public documents, Israeli news reports, and photographs, that one of the locations that was struck by Iranian ballistic missiles on June 13th was directly above Site 81. So I don't know if Iran knew that was the site. I don't know what they were targeting specifically other than Hakiria, but it struck directly above Site 81. And this is the significant part. Site 81 is located almost directly below or in the shadow of the Da Vinci towers. So what this means is a residential tower is being used to human shield one of the most sensitive, secretive aspects of Israel's military intelligence apparatus, command and control. And I think that's the takeaway from this piece. And just one other point or something to note is that a reporter from Fox News, Trey Inkst, showed up at the site of this strike or these series of ballistic missile strikes on June 13th. And there's footage of Israeli police pushing him away and demanding that he not film. Israel has since shielded this area further to prevent the public from filming it with high walls. And they've basically evacuated some of these areas. So there's an acknowledgement there that they don't want the public to know about this or the press to know about these areas. It's all sort of it remains under official censorship. But the Israelis can no longer claim that Iran is trying to kill Israeli civilians when this was clearly a military target.
What's the understanding on the part of the Israeli officials when it comes to new attacks on Iran? Do they have any sort of assessment internally that what would be the main objective if they can achieve that? And what would be the outcome for Israel in terms of the new missiles coming into Israel and maybe destroying other sites, military and intelligence sites?
I haven't been able to parse through the comments by Israeli officials to understand what they expect to achieve. It appears to me that there's still a delusional thinking among the Israeli political leadership that regime change can be achieved in Iran. And this is something we've also reported on. We republished a piece by Jack Paulson exposing the fact that Mossad is increasing its online recruitment efforts of Iranians in the diaspora, especially in Germany, promising lots of lucrative payouts and opportunities to get their family out of Iran and to relocate them, to subsidize their housing if they can provide information on sensitive Iranian facilities, especially nuclear facilities. And so they're specifically recruiting Iranians in the diaspora, but also inside Iran, who work in these facilities. And weirdly, the Mossad is running this ad campaign through an LLC in Atlanta, Georgia, which is registered to an influencer, a comedian influencer named Desi Banks. I wonder what he has to say about this. We couldn't reach him. But the point is, they're still trying to degrade Iran's scientific know-how, its nuclear industry. That remains the main target for Israel. It's sort of consistent with their general strategy of mowing the lawn, where they try to, it's a disgusting phrase that Israel conceived during its siege of Gaza, where they, without achieving regime change or destroying the enemy, are able to weaken it through continuous warfare and various operations that might just last a few days, but it sets the enemy back. And so that's one thing I know they are seeking, but I've seen Israeli leadership say what we're actually seeking is to harm Iran to the point to replicate their success in Lebanon against Hezbollah, get Iran to stand down, weakened in a ceasefire, and then wage what they call wars between wars, where they degrade targets without any retaliation by Iran because Iran has been so severely weakened. That's delusional. Iran is not Lebanon. Iranian deterrence is much stronger than Hezbollah's, and they're also not located directly on Israel's doorstep. And the other aspect is the political failure of the 12-day war by Israel. Israel united the Iranian public around the flag, including large sectors of the public that has issues with the Islamic Republic, with the revolution, because of the amount of civilian casualties Israel caused, because they attacked Iranians in areas that are bastions of opposition or criticism to the Islamic Republic, like Tajrish and North Tehran, just setting off Mossad car bombs. The Mossad death squads that Israel had armed and trained inside Iran were just widely seen as terrorists and hated. The bombing of the Evin prison gateway completely backfired and killed families visiting their loved ones inside the prison, as well as social workers. So it was a total backfire by Israel. So I think if the leadership, the military intelligence apparatus in Israel is rational, which they probably are not, they'll dispense of the fantasy of regime change. But I think they exist in their own bubble, and the political dimension is also pushing Israel to war, which is Netanyahu's own survival and the sheer fanaticism of the Jewish Israeli public.
The Trump administration, when it came to power, has decided to go after Yemenis, Houthis. They said that this time going to be different. We're going to make them, feel how powerful the United States is. They went there, and after all, they have decided to withdraw from the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandab, and that region. Do you think the same curves goes to the conflict between the United States and Iran? How do they feel? Do they feel differently, or they have learned something from the first phase of the war between the United States, between Israel and Iran, and then the United States interfered? What is the point? Do you think that there are some people in the administration that they feel that they can defeat Iran, or they feel the same way that it was in the Bab el-Mandab, in the Red Sea? That's not going to work. We're not going to go in that direction.
I think the faction in the White House that believes it can defeat Iran was seated in the Knesset, or the figures were seated in the Knesset, one of them right in front of Miriam Adelson. And that was John Ratcliffe, who we identified based on comments from a Trump administration official at the Gray Zone as Mossad stenographer, someone who had convinced Trump that Iran was on the verge of producing nuclear warheads and actually even distributing nuclear warheads to Yemen's Ansarullah, another WMD hoax. John Ratcliffe is essentially unqualified for any intelligence position, even in the House of Representatives. He was a backbencher and a small town lawyer from suburban Dallas. He represented a town of like 7,000 people outside Dallas, and now he's risen to the head of the CIA. And a lot of it has to do with backing from AIPAC as Israeli intelligence, and they essentially control his thinking, while the lesser known officials in the CIA make him feel important and manipulate him in their own way. So what was he doing seated in front of Miriam Adelson? It was because he's so friendly and so close with the Israelis and played such a seminal role in getting to the point where Israel felt like it could start a war unprovoked against Iran, and that the US would rescue it from the consequences of the war it launched but could not finish. And there are other figures in the administration. The former CENTCOM chief, Michael Kurilla, was another figure that Israel loved. They called him Israel's favorite general. And it's shocking that a foreign country can have that much influence over the top U.S. military brass, that they could even say that publicly. His replacement, I think his name is Bradley Cooper. He's I can't discern any difference between him and Kurilla. Pete Hegseth, he'll do whatever Donald Trump wants. He's just a Trump loyalist, and he's more concerned with humiliating woke generals for being fat and gay than he is with actual, geopolitics. He's basically a Trump loyalist. Then you have Trump, who's erratic, J.D. Vance, who said he's against war with Iran, and the American public, which is dead set against the war, including most of MAGA except for Fox News viewers over age 55, because Fox News has become a straight up vehicle for Israel. I think with all of these factions, it's politically perilous for Donald Trump to simply green light another Israeli war. And after this peace spectacle, I think it sets the clock back on an Israeli war. I think the clock was the timeline was set back as well by Israel's self-destructive strike in Qatar, but we still have to expect that another round will come, and Israel assumes that it has a much better chance of drawing the U.S. in now than it will after a potential midterm election in which the Republicans suffer a humiliating defeat and the Democrats take control of the House and possibly even the Senate. So I still would expect somewhat in the near term the Israelis to attempt something. I just don't know what they're actually thinking. And I think we can all assume if they do launch it, it will be more violent and bloodier than the last round, and Israel will suffer a heavier blow, potentially with ballistic missiles and weapons that we hadn't even seen before.
Max, before wrapping up this session, we have a new winner of Nobel Peace Prize, and Maria Corina Machado.
Yeah.
She won. She somehow defeated Donald Trump. She's more important for the establishment than Donald Trump right now.
Yeah.
And what is the case of Venezuela? Because looking at 2021, it was the Russian opposition. 2022, it was Belarusian opposition. 2024, Iranian opposition, and right now Venezuelan opposition. What do they want from Venezuela? It's all about oil. It's something geopolitical, much beyond that. What's your take on that?
Well, the Nobel Peace Prize now has to be renamed the Nobel War Prize, because it is being engineered to give a green light to the U.S. war on Venezuela, a war which is currently underway, in which the United States is carrying out arbitrary extrajudicial executions of unknown Venezuelan citizens, branding them without any process, any legal process, as narco-terrorists, killing them on the high seas. Maria Corina Machado has been awarded the Nobel War Prize after she endorsed Donald Trump's war on Venezuela, and after she signed a cooperation document with Netanyahu's Likud party and personally appealed to Benjamin Netanyahu to lead an Israeli invasion of Venezuela. She later, a year later, called on the U.S. to launch a Libya-style military intervention in Venezuela at the same time that I personally witnessed her attempt to take over a Venezuelan military base along with members of the Venezuelan upper class opposition in Caracas. And this failed, but we can see that Maria Corina Machado represents the most radical faction of the Venezuelan opposition, which has supported sanctions, which, according to the Center for Economic and Policy Research, have killed tens of thousands of Venezuelans, as well as triggering a massive migration wave to the north, to the US-Mexico border, which has fueled the rise of Trump and the nativist anti-immigrant right, when many of those Venezuelans in Donald Trump's second term were deported not back to Venezuela, something that the government of President Nicolas Maduro was allowing and welcoming, but to a torture camp in Nayib Bukele's El Salvador, where they were humiliated. Maria Corina Machado stood not with her countrymen in Venezuela, but with Donald Trump. And this is consistent with Maria Corina Machado's entire career since she first emerged, leading a campaign called La Salida, in which she encouraged Venezuelans to call for regime change against Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro, which led to violent riots, which killed hundreds of Venezuelans. In La Salida, the parties and the political mechanism behind it was funded by the United States through the National Endowment for Democracy, which has hailed Maria Corina Machado's reception of the Nobel War Prize. Finally, Maria Corina Machado has openly promised that if the US will push ahead with an invasion of Venezuela to place her in Miraflores Palace as the president, that she will hand over Venezuela's oil wealth and mineral wealth to the highest bidder. And it appears pretty clear that a coterie of MAGA billionaires has already assembled to plunder Venezuela, which is why Elon Musk suddenly turned into a pro-regime change fanatic on Venezuela after never having mentioned the issue before, when Maria Corina Machado was running for president. So this is an award for war. It validates Donald Trump's illegal extrajudicial executions and the general push to plunder Venezuela's resources through a regime change war. And it totally discredits the Nobel Prize.
Thank you so much, Max. Great pleasure, as always, talking to you and learning from you. And your information is amazing.
Thank you so much, Nima.
See you.